Today on Nova Legends podcast, I have ESPN investigative reporter TJ Quinn. TJ is a graduate of West Potomac. He's going to join us talk about his journey. TJ, great to meet you. Thanks for doing this.
Pleasure. The word legends throws me off. I think you're lowering the standard a little bit. It's all right. It's great to talk to you.
Well, I've been doing it for a long time, so we're down to journalistic legends.
Working down the list, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, let me introduce you first. As I said, you're I believe 87 graduate of West Potomac. TJ?
86
graduate,
first
okay.
class. Yep.
Yeah, you're 2 years behind. 2 years behind me. I was 84 at Robinson. I believe you came to the area. Your dad went to Georgetown. Was a boxer at Georgetown University. So I assume you're well behaved at home always. But you found your way to Northern Virginia. You started at Fort Hunt, and as we started to say, Fort Hunt and Groveton merged. They went to the Groveton building, and it became West Potomac. You went to the University of Missouri, where you studied journalism. First job was the Daily Southern in Chicago, covering the school boards and city councils.
Southtown, the Daily Southtown, yeah. That strong South Side connection there, yeah.
Oh yeah, I bet you really learned the hard way, kind of hard scrabble type stuff, school boards, city councils. And then you ended up in Salt Lake, trying to get the other viewpoint, which I had to be a culture shock. Salt Lake Tribune, and I think you're covering politics in Salt Lake. Is that true, TJ?
A little bit. I start some growth issues, transportation, which is actually a phenomenal beat, and then in some politics. I was only there 1 year and 4 days, but packed a lot in.
Oh, well, yeah. And then you back to the Daily. I want to make sure I get it right. Daily South.
Southtown.
Southtown, right. Daily Southtown, and you're covering the White Sox. And I know all journalists, sports journalists, want to cover baseball. That's so many of the iconic American sports writers are in baseball. That must have been amazing. Then you went to New Jersey, covered the Mets for the Bergen Record, and then in 2000, the amazing Daily News, that iconic centrist daily, covering the Mets again. Got into some sports investigation there, doing a little BALCO work. And then in 2007, ESPN called. You're in the enterprise unit, and Sports Center, Outside the Lines, a lot of stuff we've seen. A lot of your features we've probably seen and not even know you're necessarily involved in all of it. And then you're adjunct professor at Columbia. Did I get most of that right, TJ?
Very impressive. I'm not sure I would have gotten all this right. Yeah, pretty much. I haven't worked at Columbia in a number of years. I was an adjunct there for 7 years, and I still lecture every year, journalism school and the law school. But the not full time, but the permanent teaching gig, I haven't done in a while.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you got that. You got it on the resume anyway. Well, let's start with that. When you're talking to young journalists, sports journalism and probably journalism generally is in a very different place than it was when you started out. Like for example, your job at ESPN a long time ago. Those are the only great national sports channel jobs. I mean, you had local sports, you could work in a local outfit, but now media's changing a little bit. People have podcasts. Like Gilbert Arenas will just start a podcast. There's so many different ways to get into journalism now. It's mostly more online type of material. Where is journalism now in terms of the coverage and also for the aspiring journalists? Are they in good places right now?
Oh, I mean, the landscape is so hard to figure out. And yeah, it's brutally different. When I was in journalism school, there were three concentrations: news editorial, broadcast, or advertising. When my son went there in 2016 to the same school, there were 38. And, convergence and digital and production and all this. I would maintain that journalism is journalism. The basics have not changed. Reporting is reporting, and there is still an appetite for it. The problem is the business has changed so much that it's hard to tell young people how to plot out their careers, what to go after. When I knew I wanted to be a newspaper writer, so you leave school, you go to a small paper, which I did. You try to get to a bigger paper, which I did, and then try to get to a really big paper. You follow that ladder. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, I actually had no ambition to work in TV. The ESPN thing just kind of, it was a funny story. I just sort of fell in our laps. But, you know, now I work at ESPN now, but what we do is mostly digital and online. You know, I still do a fair amount of TV, but when I went there, ESPN was what, you know, you call traditional linear cable TV. Everything's about the product that goes on the air, that goes in straight to people's televisions in their homes. Now you watch on devices, you watch clips, you watch a lot of the highlights on social media. The company is quickly shifting to streaming only. At some point, that's what we're going to be. TV is not what it was. Newspapers are still it's amazing there are any left to disappear, but they're still disappearing. You know, I look at it like we're back in the days of the pamphleteers, back in the 1800s. It's sort of where anybody is a potential publisher. And the exciting thing is that if you're good at what you do and can get some support for it, you can break out and find your own audience. The problem is that people don't know the difference between what I do and people who have, you know, a traditional grounded training in journalism do, and somebody just spouting off an opinion. So it is such a mess right now. And when I meet, you know, and I speak to students a lot, all the time. And when I do, I always get that question, what's your advice for a young person? And my advice is always learn your craft, learn how to report, learn how to get documents, learn how to get information, learn how to interview people, learn how to get the basics. But the biggest thing to me with journalism that doesn't change is how you think about the world around you. You know, are you thinking critically? Are you an advocate or are you a journalist? Do you understand that your job is to collect a set of facts so that a democratic society can debate something and come to conclusions? Or are you in it because you have an agenda that you want to push, no matter how much you believe in it? That's not journalism. Now we can get into a whole other debates about, is there such a thing as objectivity? That's, you know, it's a much, much deeper conversation, but yeah, it's kind of a terrifying landscape. I see it firsthand with, you know, my oldest son, Liam, who's now a journalist. He covers crime at People Magazine, which is a terrific gig. That's not something they did when I was young.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's just, you know, if you want to survive in this business, learn to do everything and understand that whatever you think journalism is right now, it's not going to be that in 5 years.
No. Well, you know, you're an investigative journalist. So like getting involved in BALCO, the doping that keeps the integrity of the game with Brittany Griner was just, you know, whether or not she was unlawfully detained for a year, all this political intrigue. You were involved with Tyler Skaggs, the pitcher that was that was found dead. Do you ever miss just the games? So as an investigative journalist, you have an important role in to letting us know if the games are above board, and also about the personalities of the game. Are they what we say they are? But do you ever miss just the pennant race, the games, the ups and downs, whether you made a mistake?
So there are times, I mean, so I was a Major League Baseball beat writer for 7 years. And for 5 of those, I'm covering Bobby Valentine with the New York Mets, which was intense. You know, if you're a baseball fan, you know, Bobby is one of the smartest, most prickly personalities in the game. I learned so much from him. I also banged heads with him so many times. There was something about covering a beat where you're the person on the inside that was so fantastic. You know, you're the one who sees what's going on day to day. You're the conduit, and you're in this vicious competition, especially in New York. You know, like you said, I was at the New York Daily News, which used to be the biggest paper in the world. In the 1950s, it had a circulation of, you know, of more than 2 million a day. And when I was there, it was still one of the 3, 4 biggest in the country. And you're up against the New York Post, which is another New York City tab, and a blood feud. And you got the New York Times and Newsday and the Bergen Record and the Newark Star Ledger and the Journal News. And, you know, it is vicious. And the day I came off that beat and didn't have to wake up thinking, when is my boss, Leon Carter, going to call? When am I going to find out what the Post had that I missed? It was like a, you know, feeling when you're in a kitchen and refrigerator shuts off and you realize you didn't notice the sound. I just 7 years of that sound in your head of what am I missing? What am I not doing? I also weighed 40 more pounds than I do now because it is so stressful. And I went Friday, I went with my son to the Mets home opener. And as it's getting late in the game, and it was, I think it was 1-0 or something, or maybe tied at that point, and thinking, oh, thank God I don't have to write this. I can just sit and enjoy it. I don't have to sit and think about, I'm not going to make a game story out of this.
Yeah.
You do miss it. And for me, I got a little bit of that. I've done the Olympics 4 times for us. But that also got so difficult after a while. It's the security is so tough. Your access is so limited. You kind of miss that. When I call somebody, they're not happy to hear from me. Nobody ever wants to get a call. If they know who I am, they're not happy to hearing from me. And it was I think I can't remember what year it was. Sometime after I got to ESPN, they did have me fill in as a sideline reporter for one of the baseball playoff series. And so I went to, somebody can figure it out. It was Detroit, Baltimore, whatever year that was for the division series. And I'm on the field at Camden, and Dan Duquette was the GM of the Orioles at the time. And he comes up, he goes, "Is there anything I need to know?" And I said, no, it's all good. Just here to do baseball.
Yeah.
So you miss it, but I also, I care about the work I do now in a way I didn't before. It was competitive and it was fun. Look, I got paid to go to the ballpark. Who wouldn't like that? But I also, the world that we're living in, it helps sometimes to feel more engaged.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm reminded when you talked about your publisher or your boss at the Daily News, of those movies in the 30s about newspaper reporters, like His Girl Friday, and they had a lot of Woman of the Year, some great movies about reporters. But do you ever wonder what it was like in the 50s when you had, or the 40s, when you had the Giants, when you had the Dodgers, and when you had the Yankees, and you had all the papers that covered them? Can you imagine? It must have been magical to cover baseball at that point.
Well, I got to know a lot of those guys, and it was the romance of that got me into it. The first time the idea of being a baseball writer got into my head was when I was a student at Mizzou, and so I grew up. We moved to Northern Virginia when I was 6, but I was from New York, and my parents are both from New York. My parents are both Brooklyn Dodgers fans. My dad's from Long Island. My mom was from Brooklyn. I grew up with the romance of baseball, and when we moved to Virginia, this is mid 70s, and so we became Yankees fans just because they were good, and it was something that made us connect with home. The Mets were terrible. I was actually a lifelong Mets fan, but for those years, he needed something. That was it, and so I knew the stories of those years. I knew the romance of it. I also was lucky enough that my dad was friends with Mel Allen, the legendary longtime announcer for the Yankees. So the first Yankee game I ever went to, it sat next to him. I loved the romance of it and of the writers and reading, oh man, Red Smith, Jimmy Cannon, Dick Young, names that a lot, even baseball writers today might not know. But to us, they were legends. And so when my dad and I went to visit New York for a weekend when I was a student at Mizzou, we ran into 2 guys from the Daily News, one named Mike McAlery, who later won a Pulitzer Prize, and his boss, Hap Hairston, just incredible guy. And here they're talking to this 19-year-old kid and who wants to do what they do. And McAlery said to me, "You want to be good at this job? Cover a baseball beat. If you can make 162 games interesting, you can do anything." And he was right. Just the way you engage, the way you think about and identify stories. And then, the old guys were still around. I got to hang out with Yogi Berra at the ballpark.
Oh,
I got to know, if you're a baseball fan, you probably know Ralph Branca and Bobby Thompson.
Of course.
And, and for those who are a little younger, I mean, the shot heard around the world, October 3rd, 1951, the Giants win the pennant. Beating the Dodgers in game 3 of a playoff on a home run to go to the World Series to lose to the Yankees. And So one of the little roles I had in my baseball writing career is for 2 years, I was chapter chairman. I was a chairman of the New York chapter of the Baseball Writers Association of America. And we honored Ralph Branca and Bobby Thompson on the 50th anniversary of that home run.
Hmm.
And so I got to introduce the two of them and talk to them with my parents sitting. They'd been divorced for years, but for this, they sat together and, and get to hear these guys thank me by name, which was just unbelievable. I talked to guys who played with Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig. I met Negro leaguers. I met people who played with Jackie Robinson. I spent a fair amount of time talking to Jackie's widow, Rachel Robinson, and his daughter Sharon, who are just two unbelievable women. Rachel Robinson was just, to talk to her and to connect that era and Jackie's life and that's if you're not a romantic, it's not the right world for you, but I thought about that. We thought of that all the time. Why can't we wear hats anymore? Why can't we clack on typewriters instead of click on laptops? I think we would have loved that world.
Do we write about baseball differently now than we did then? Like those iconic writers that you mentioned in the 50s, up until the time when you wrote about it in the 90s, and now. Is the writing the same about baseball, or has the writing changed? Is it shorter? Is it less fluff, or in any ways has it changed?
It's gotten way more technical. I would argue on one point, it's gotten better because it used to be, you read some of those old stories and what you can't remove the content from the context. And the context of it was an incredibly closed world. It was white men writing about white men. It was, you did not have women in the press box. I mean, it's still sometimes mind-boggling to me that my first season in '96 covering the White Sox, and we traveled to Oakland for a series. And one of the guys from Chicago, one of the older guys I worked with, said, "Oh, geez, I hate to see that." I said, "What do you mean?" And he's pointing to the writers from the Bay Area, and he said, all the girls and everything, they're taking jobs from our guys. This is 1996. Wow. I said, I don't know who our guys are, but I don't think I'm one of them. And he immediately realized, oh God, but there was still plenty of that, well past even when I started. So go back to the 30s, 40s, 50s. One of the absolute legends of the time was Paul Gallico at the Daily News, who became an editor, was a well-known writer. He wasn't a chauvinist. He was a misogynist. I mean, he was, and he wasn't just a bigot. He was a vicious anti-Semite. He was a vicious racial bigot. These were the guys who were running the show back then. So the content was to continue to glorify and build heroes out of the guys on the field without looking at who they really were or what place they played in society. It was pure entertainment reporting. And the biggest shifts that you saw, well, one in terms of context, really started in the 70s when you had more women starting to go into the business. My dear, dear friend Claire Smith at the New York Times, who was the first woman to cover full-time. Claire, not only a woman, but Black, and trying to walk into this world.
Wow.
And it's funny to see Steve Garvey running for the Senate in California now, when he was the one who actually went and grabbed her when she was, locked out of the Dodgers clubhouse.
Right?
And said, no, anybody you need. Garvey is the one who came out.
That's awesome.
It was.
Yeah, I didn't like it. I was always on the Yankee side of that, but I digress. Go ahead.
Yeah, right. So and they also had this change because of Watergate in the 70s, and this idea of, well, I'm sorry, also culturally in the 60s as well, when Jim Bouton wrote the book Ball 4 in 1969,
sure,
and exposed all these secrets. Writers started this shift. It didn't happen overnight, but started a shift from being participants in that world to, voices for the players, to actually being journalists. And there's some great writing that came out of those eras, but there wasn't a lot of great journalism. It was it was hero building. And that changed over the decades. I think the entrance of women into the profession was part of that as well. They weren't part of the good old boys club, and so they were going to look at the game differently. But then you've also seen more, so just that change is monumental on its own. But in addition to that, what you've seen change is, even before metrics in the 90s, you started to see people look at the game the way the technical people in baseball did, and front offices did. What is a guy's average of runners in scoring position? How does a guy do against lefties? It wasn't just painting pretty pictures to impress everybody with your writing. It was, let's really analyze what's happening on the game. And now these days, to try to keep up with the number of stats that there are, to understand what they mean, it's a completely different job.
Yeah, I think in some ways, Bill James and Billy Beane were fighting against journalists who would paint these players as being able to overcome any situation. And Bill James is like, well, no, it's the numbers are the numbers. Sometimes they get a hit in the clutch, sometimes they don't. We're making these guys into something that they really not. I think in some ways, what do they call it? What's the word for the baseball?
Sabermetrics.
Sabermetrics.
Yeah.
In some ways, it kind of went against the vision and the pictures that the journalists were painting.
Completely. And that was a tough thing. When you're writing it, the history of sports journalism has been telling stories about plucky young people who have, if you're good at a sport, it means you're a good person, and that you're overcoming odds and achieving new heights like the great, Greek and Roman heroes, and inspiring others with what you do. And the reality is that most of the elite athletes we have are kind of borderline psychopathic about the way they go into what they do. I'm not accusing them clinically of being psychopaths, but I'm saying it is a monomaniacal focus on one thing. And then you could have a whole debate on the idea of human agency, about, how much agency does anybody have to be who they are? Did Lance Armstrong really have a choice to become Lance Armstrong? What drove him? That was a big change in journalism, was starting, I think, trying to have a real psychological, sports journalism in particular, but to have a sort of more psychological understanding of what was going on. You saw that with the great magazine writing out of Sports Illustrated, and particularly in the 70s and 80s, Frank DeFord and Gary Smith and some of their legendary writers. Now you're trying to, what is driving this person? Back in the days of Babe Ruth, if people really knew what Ruth was like when he was playing, with the women 2-3 at a time, and the drinking and, everything else. Look, some people might have liked him more, but he wouldn't have been on the cereal boxes. It was all just a big scam, and everybody was in on it. And it was, and there was kind of a naivete and an innocence to it, but not anymore. Now it's, if you're going to understand the game, you understand, the fallacy of the hot hand, right? The idea that if somebody makes 5 shots in a row, he's more likely to make 6. No, he's just as likely to make that shot, but it doesn't fit our hero narrative.
Yeah.
And so there's always kind of that tension where if you don't buy into, all right, like here's the perfect one to me. How we talk about no hitters, right? In baseball, it's always been, if a guy's throwing a no hitter, you don't say it's a no hitter. And then I've seen where people will criticize announcers if they say, oh, so-and-so has no hits after this inning, is working on a no hitter, and like, oh my God, you're going to jinx him, as if that has anything to do with what's happening on the field. And that's the old mindset, is that there's a set of rules, there's a set of beliefs, and if you really want to be a baseball fan, you buy into that and you propagate those rules and beliefs, even if they're absolute nonsense. And journalism used to kind of go along with that because we were part of that club. Well, if you're doing your job, yes, an announcer saying the words no hitter in a booth has zero impact on how well a guy executes a slider and a 1-2 count.
Yeah. There was a jockey yesterday that's been hot at Gulfstream Park named Paco Lopez, and a buddy of mine lives close, named Peter Knapp, said they must have given this guy the stop sign because the last week his horses hadn't been running very good. And I said, Pete, I think he's probably just, kind of regressing to the mean. Sometimes it's not these big conspiracies. It's just, the numbers are the numbers. When you dive deep inside, when you're reporting on BALCO and the doping with the Barry Bonds, Marion Jones, in those situations, are you ever conflicted in that? First of all, they're never by themselves. That there's a culture sometimes of you mentioned earlier that a lot of these athletes have this psycho focus towards being the best, and if cutting corners is part of that, it's just kind of accepted. Are you ever conflicted when you're reporting on these? The Lance Armstrong thing was very frustrating to me because it was so obvious to anyone who really knew the game that he was doping, be it Sally Jenkins and others wrote these books. And I felt like they were never going to report the truth, even though it was so obvious. So as a journalist, is that really tough work when you know that you're going to have to break hearts? You're going to have to take some chances and you're going to have to tell the truth.
I mean, you sort of accept that when you accept the job, is that, all right, that's what this is. You're always, if you have a conscience and you're a critical thinker, you're always conflicted, I think. So where are the conflicts and how do you manage them? One is, look, I don't want to be at the guy at parties to tell you how awful your hero is. I don't want to do that. I like these guys too growing up. And I can't tell you how relieved I was that Tom Seaver turned out to be a really nice guy, when I dealt with him.
Yeah.
But I met a lot of guys who were absolute jerks. Again, to grow up around the DC area and then find out what Frank Robinson's personality is actually like.
Oh, is that right?
is,
Oh,
Frank was awful.
I didn't know
It
that.
doesn't diminish anything he did as a player, as a manager, as a figure in the game. But yeah, he was terrible to be around, treated people terribly. What you try to do, what you remind yourself your job is tell a story accurately. So if I'm writing about Barry Bonds, and I've got a funny relationship with him, when I was around him during the game, and then 98 happens and you see McGuire and Sosa, and you're like, something's not quite right. These guys just don't look like that. I remember what Sammy looked like when he came out of the Dominican Republic, and then McGuire was a pitcher when he came out of college. And then, now he did hit 49 home runs as a rookie first baseman when he was still kind of built like that, but you knew what was going on. How do you write about things that you can't prove? When you saw what was going on, there were players I covered, I know they were doping, but I didn't have evidence that they were, so I can't write it. So what do? Temper the way you write? If a guy hits a 500-foot home run and it's absolutely incredible, do you just get into how cool it was to see it happen? Or do you somehow couch it? You can't. You have a journalistic obligation to only write what you know and what you can prove. And it's funny, I've had people ask me many times, when do you go with a story like that? When do you know it's enough to publish? And my answer is when you know it's right. Not not when you have two sources, not when whatever. No, it's when the information you have is solid enough, it's right. I remember, I really do to this day remind myself all the time that these are human beings you're dealing with. If this was me, someone was writing about, I want to make sure they did it right. And so I take that care when I go into it. It's never personal. I did have an incident about 10 years ago where there was a player I wrote about who got busted, attacked a bunch of people, and then eventually came out that, what we wrote was completely right. And I later got a phone call from a PR guy saying, this player would like to talk to you to apologize. I said, well, I'm really not interested in an apology. He said, why? I said, because I have no personal relationship with him. I said, it was never personal. He doesn't owe me an apology. He didn't do anything to me. I said, if he wants to talk to me on the record, great. And he said, no, it's just to apologize. I said, an apology. I said, it means nothing to me. It's never personal. It was never personal. I've never gone after an athlete, and I can still see the human side of it. I remember talking to Jason Giambi in the Yankees clubhouse one time about doping stuff. And Jason did a lot of drugs, but he's also a really nice guy and a human being. You can't forget that. When I was covering Barry Bonds and he was in the home run chase, we all knew what was going on. And Barry Barry's a fascinating guy. He's very, very smart. And not just baseball smart. There's always that where you say, oh, guy's really smart. Well, in a baseball setting, he's smart. No, Barry's real world smart.
Mm.
And this was 2007 spring training. And right before the season, I had been on a trip to Ghana with a bunch of people from Major League Baseball. It was kind of a goodwill trip, and I somehow, finagled my way into this, and it was pretty incredible. Dusty Baker, Dave Winfield, one of them was Reggie Smith, who, fans in the 70s will remember was an incredible player with the Dodgers and the Red Sox, and who's Barry's cousin. And so we get back, and now I'm in Arizona for spring training, and we all have our notebooks in our pockets, just kind of chatting. And all of a sudden, Barry Bonds, this guy who we've been, bang heads with all the time, it could be just awful to us on the most banal stuff. He could just snap. You never knew why. We're just chatting like people. And it was kind of like those apocryphal stories of the Germans and the British during World War I playing soccer between the trenches. And, and someone said to him, when you are done, what do you want to do? And he said, I really want to travel. He said, I really want to go to Africa. And I said, I was just there. I said, did you talk to Reggie about the trip to Ghana? And he said, no, I haven't talked to him yet. And all of a sudden, we're two people talking about my trip to Africa a month earlier. Wow. Just normal people. And here's this smart, engaged guy. And then it's like they blew the whistles and we run back to the trenches and everybody starts firing at each other again. Yeah. But when I was covering his trial in 2009 in San Francisco, his federal trial on obstruction charges, we could have very human moments between it. He'd come in and say, TJ, you're doing a hell of a job. I'd say, Barry, you're doing a hell of a job yourself. And we just kind of laugh. His mother said she didn't trust me, but she liked my hair. It's a lot darker at the time. You just, whatever conflicts there are, you just remind yourself, I'm a human being doing a job about other human beings. Be professional, be courteous, don't take it personally, and just know at the end of the day, you did your job the right way.
Yeah. Well, there was a French cyclist during the Armstrong years named David Moncoutier. I'm not sure if you ever heard of him, but he was a phenomenal cyclist. But he would just try to focus on one or two stage wins in the Tour de France and maybe some of the one-day races, because he was an adamant guy that he was not going to dope. And he had in his contract, if you try to make me dope, I'm going to quit the team. And so he never showed any bitterness to the fact that all the other Tour contenders were doping. Was there ever a personality in baseball that you can remember that was hitting home runs, but was playing the game fair at that during that time period and was bitter about it, but wouldn't say anything? That's one thing I never heard. I never heard a lot of baseball players like Moncoutier would talk about it, but he wouldn't talk about it in a bad way. But he would put that idea in your head, like, look, I could do more if everyone else wasn't cheating. I never heard that in baseball. Did you?
I did actually, and it was you didn't hear guys say it on the record like you just said. But I did have players say, you'd sit in a clubhouse and a guy would be like, look at so-and-so, look at his back, look at, first of all, where that 20 pounds of muscle come from. Second, look at all the acne there. And now this guy's hitting more home runs than me. And people are asking me why my power is diminishing. He's like, I hit the same number every year. But all of a sudden, because there was that feeling that you guys don't belong in here. If you need to do that, you don't belong in here. And I remember talking to one of Lance Armstrong's teammates, Frankie Andreu, who said, and Frankie saying to me in his kitchen in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that he said, I got to that point in my career where I realized either I start taking the drugs or I get another career. And he said, because I saw guys, he said, I am killing myself on these climbs, and there are guys hanging with me who have no business hanging with me. And he said, I made, I had to make a choice. And that happened to so many athletes. With cycling, it's different because it's all endurance. Yeah, yes, now we can get into the mental strength of that and how you can have a million people with the physical talents and the ability to process oxygen the way Lance Armstrong could. and you put them all on the best drugs in the world, and they're still not going to beat him because mentally they would not have what he had.
Yeah.
You know, there are 10,000 guys with the skills to play Major League Baseball. There are 750 with the full package, which is that mental strength to do it. That's the difference between good and great and elite athletes. And sometimes the best of them reach this other level where that's why I referred to them, again, not clinically as psychopaths, but this ability to change reality in your world. I had a Yankee club official come up to me, when Roger Clemens, when his name came up in the Mitchell report as having used drugs, and someone came, someone I'd known in the clubhouse for a very long time with the Yankees came up and said, people don't get it. If Roger says the sky is purple, it is. He's not lying. That's reality because Roger just said it was. That's the approach for these guys. I impose my will, my view of reality on the world. If 2 + 2 = 5, it is because I said so. And that's kind of the mentality. And so there you did see ball players who felt like, these guys don't have what it takes to be in here. And so why should they get that advantage of a drug? But to call them out publicly and to say it was a step too far. It would be to be a pariah inside the game. You also could be sued, but you'd have everybody else would turn on that guy, even if they agreed with him. And so what you did have in baseball, I really believe, having been around it as long as I have, that there was a genuine change in the culture. That the reason you don't see drugs in the game the way you did, and I don't think you see it the way you did, was not because Congress got involved, not because Major League Baseball got testing the right way. If testing is effective now, it's because the players decided we don't want this in the game. And guys didn't say it to people like me, but they did say to each other, this has to stop. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I'd done some reporting on this that 1959, going into the Rome Olympics, one of the U.S. team physician found out through a very drunk Russian team physician what powerlifters were doing. They were doing Dianabol, the first commercially available steroid, and he came back and told the team, this is what those guys are doing. And the U.S. powerlifters discussed it. Should we do this? And they all agreed at the time, no, we don't want the drug to win. We want to know that we're the ones doing it. So they went into those games clean. And the Soviets took 8 out of 9 gold medals. And then all of a sudden, wow, that suddenly changed their opinion on the matter. And they realized this is going to be the cost of doing business.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then that's the pressure of the athlete. And I have talked to Betsy. There are two situations that always have bothered me about baseball, and they're both kind of before your time, but I know you may have an opinion on it. I was always hurt when Willie Stargel's name came out in the congressional report in the was Dale Barra was touting on all the players, and I love that Pirates team, the We Are Family season, and Willie Stargel is one of the most incredible characters. If you love sports, he's the kind of athlete you're going to love because he was never bitter towards his teammates. He wasn't arrogant, and he was a great player. That always bothered me when his name was brought up. And and that situation, and also the Mike Smith, I never could figure out what was going on with Mike Smith. He was he couldn't win a game for the Mets. And then for the Astros 3 or 4 years later, he was the most untouchable pitcher in the world. They could see the scuffs on the ball, and they let him get away with it. He's never admitted it all these years he did it, but something changed. Maybe it was just a split finger, but those two situations about baseball have always bothered me. Have you ever thought about either one of those situations?
Well, with Pop Stargel, you're talking about the drug trials in
The drug trials. I'm
mid
sorry,
'80s. Yeah, I mean that was. The people. I was not a Pirates fan. Obviously, I was a Mets fan in those years. But you couldn't not love him, right? Pop
Yeah.
Stargel, that's the guy you want on your team. That one of the greatest natural leaders you ever saw. I love Dave Parker, the Cobra, and
He should be in the Hall of Fame.
He absolutely should be in the Hall of Fame. And I had a chance to meet him some years later. You know, with the drug trials, I mean, it was tough because you had, I mean, this is the Reagan years and the ideas about cocaine, and you know, the embarrassment that it was to them. Look, cocaine is different than weed. It just is, and it was not a great thing for the game when you had those guys, and and Keith Hernandez, who was later one of my favorites with the Mets, and Tim Raines, the nicest guy you ever meet in your life. I didn't like the idea that those guys were treated as total pariahs, and eventually I think their reputations did recover. It was tough to see at the game, but at the time it was that kind of black and white morality about recreational drug use that we had. You can't say that anything those guys did affected what you saw on the field. And to me, it just sort of forced your public to mature of, hey, look, this is also what your favorite musicians and actors, are doing at the moment. It's the 1980s, right? Everybody's doing cocaine. I was not, but I was also, a young person, but wasn't a morality thing necessarily. I think it kind of forced people to grow up a little bit, that this is who these guys are. It's just sort of the way you ignore the drinking culture of Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford and Billy Martin and those guys, and the excesses of their eras. With Mike Scott with the Astros, now that drove me crazy because I was a Mets fan, and that splitter is almost what beat them in '86, one of the greatest NLCSs ever.
He was the MVP on a losing team. What pitcher's ever done that?
He was well, not that year, but yeah, he was. I mean, he was ridiculous, right? It was, and I've heard, I did run into guys years later, because those guys in the mid '80s were still around the Mets when I was covering him in the late '90s. And like, God, that guy, he really didn't have any business being there. But nobody ever, I don't know, nobody ever nailed it. Nobody ever proved it. Now, the one cheating thing that always drove me crazy is the idea of the cork bat, that everybody thought that was cheating, when if you read the physics on it, it makes it harder to hit home runs. And it always cracked me up that with Sammy Sosa, it was so obvious this guy was juicing, and nobody's talking about that. But then he has a bat during batting practice that explodes and rubber comes out all over the field. And everyone's saying that's how he's cheating. And I'm like, oh my God, no, it harms the integrity of the bat. You lose energy in the transfer of bat to ball. When you do that, it's a huge myth. I don't care what the players say. It's ridiculous. But that's what everybody jumped on Sammy for, because now they decided he was a cheater.
Yeah, he was trying to cheat, and it was actually working against him. Has baseball handled all these episodes correctly, including like Pete Rose, but all the like Barry Bonds and McGuire, they're not in the Hall of Fame. Clemens, these are absolute national icons that go beyond baseball. Has baseball handled them correctly?
It's correctly is tough to say. I mean, take Pete Rose, for example, and I covered Pete a fair amount, and my great colleague Willie Weinbaum, he and it was 100% Willie. I was just there along for the ride. We got a hold of the notebook 10 years ago that showed that Pete had been betting on the Reds while he was managing them, after denying it. Pete's biggest enemy is Pete. Pete is the one who had a chance, back in 1989. He was offered 2 deals, and Bud Selig confirmed this for me on the record. First, he was offered a 10-year suspension, and then a 7-year suspension if he would agree to it. Pete is the one who said, no, what I'm going to do is accept this permanent banishment from the game, except that allows you to apply again within a year. So he figured, rather than take my 7 years, 10 years, he could have been back in the game after 7 years and would have been fine until he got himself in trouble with something else, probably. But He's the one who said, no, I'm gonna go for it. And Bart Giamatti, then the commissioner, told him, you have to reconfigure your life. He has never reconfigured his life. He kept lying to baseball over and over again. Bud Selig wanted nothing more than to bring Pete Rose back into the game because Bud knew it would make him a hero. And people who think that, no, he just had it in for him. No, I'm telling you, I talked to him. I talked to Mike Schmidt. I talked to the people around them. He would love to have been able to say, yes, Pete has redeemed himself. Welcome back into baseball. People would have loved that. Pete made it impossible. So I can never blame them for that. With the steroid stuff, look, they ignored it for a long time, what was right in front of them. And what I didn't like was that players were suspended and nobody from the front office ever was. They knew what was going on. If you're supposed, and if they didn't, then they're not as good at their jobs as they said they were. You're supposed to be a talent evaluator. You can't tell me what's the difference between a guy who shows up a year later, 20 pounds heavier and faster and leaner. And your experienced eye doesn't tell you what might have been contributing to that. Bud Selig wasn't punished for it. Nobody in the front office, any team was punished for it. It was just players who were suspended. Should they have been? Well, the players think so. They're the ones who helped develop these rules. And I didn't like the morality of it. It's not a clean thing. I used to vote for the Hall of Fame as a 10-year veteran of the Baseball Writers Association. And I actually gave up my ballot and said, I'm not going to do this anymore because I felt, baseball did not have a standard on how to evaluate these guys. There wasn't the conversation they needed to have about how to deal with them. I had fellow voters who said, I won't vote for anybody connected to steroids. Well, all right. Well, look, Hank Aaron, Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, three of the greatest in the history of the game, all used amphetamines in their careers. They all admitted it.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, they did. I mean, Hank said he didn't do it till his last year, but just because that's what you did, everybody did. So that if they did it today, they'd be suspended. Are you going to tell me Hank Aaron, Willie Mays don't belong in the Hall of Fame? Are you kidding me? Those you can't argue that those drugs really made them who they are. And if I'm a 16-year-old Dominican kid, and I can, and I've spent a lot of time in the Dominican Republic. I've been there at least a dozen times, and I'm never on beaches. I'm in neighborhoods where these guys are from. And you're telling me that the ethical, moral choice for a 16-year-old is don't take a drug that could maybe get your family set up for the next 5 generations? Where's the moral imperative there? I didn't like how black and white it was, but I also felt at the end of the day, and I wrote about this actually when I gave up my Hall of Fame ballot, Roger Clemens, Barry Bonds should be in the Hall of Fame. I also don't want to be the one to put him there, right?
Yeah.
I was not, and I felt like baseball kind of missed a moral obligation to define what the criteria should be. Now they'll say, well, look, the Hall of Fame is a separate institution. Come on, it isn't. It isn't. Yes, it has its own board, but Rob Manfred is on the board. Owners are on the board. It's not like these are completely independent entities. They're completely symbiotic. Baseball could have set a standard of rules. So is it right that they're not in? I don't know what right is. If they were in, I think their plaques should say what they did. They're in the museum part of it. If you go to Cooperstown, there's the hall and then there's the building next to it, and you can still see what they did there. Pete Rose is in that building. Should Pete Rose be in the other side of it? I have no moral authority to say, but I can tell you that with Pete, he just made it absolutely impossible for himself.
TJ, one thing that occurs to me is we mentioned Jackie Robinson and Willie Mays. A lot of these great athletes, when they became able to play baseball, they changed the game. The way they stole bases, just their flamboyance, and just their athletic ability, and the way they thought the game was different, and the style of the game changed. But recently, African Americans aren't playing baseball as much. I went to a game last year where there were 2 people of color on the field, but they were Latino. They were from Dominican Republic. They were dark skinned, but they weren't American black athletes. Do you think that baseball will change again because black athletes are playing other sports and not playing baseball? Will the game change in a certain way?
Well, the way it's the two major influences of it have been one, the Latin American influence, where you've got the best players are coming out of the Dominican Republic, some other countries to some extent, Venezuela, not quite as much as you had before, just because of the conditions in the country. But what's changed in this country, you're not gonna have the numbers of Black Americans in the game that baseball that you thought might happen in the 70s when you were at your peak. When you had
Stargel, Parker, Winfield, Jackson.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah. And what changed was the money, frankly. And it became, I did a story when I was still at the Daily News, looking at baseball's efforts to create academies in American cities and urban areas where they're targeting primarily young Black athletes because it's obviously a huge pool of athletic talent. Baseball is a skill sport, and if your family cannot afford the $150 an hour lessons and the $400, $500 baseball bats and the travel schedule and everything else. I went and looked at in LA, Centennial High School in Compton and Beverly Hills High School. And I looked at the records at the matchups over the past few years. Beverly Hills destroyed Centennial when it came to baseball, 24-1, 18-3. These ridiculous games. And then you looked at basketball and Centennial's winning 20, 30 points in a high school game. So you can't say it's not the athletes, and you can't say that there is some inherent skill that a white player is going to have to play baseball. Now, there were generations where no, it's you did have people who believed it was too cerebral or whatever. No, it's a skill, it's training. And if you don't have the access to the training, you're going to get left behind very quickly. Now, the reason so many kids come out of the Dominican Republic, which is this, impoverished nation that has grown, since I first started going there, it's incredible how much it's grown, and it's not wealthy, but it's wealthier than it was. It's because all they're doing is playing baseball all day long. Kids don't even play games; they just train. You go to any field in the country, and that's all you're seeing. So the best ones get identified early. They get put into these academies. Sometimes you have these American benefactors who are, pretty sketchy, who realize if I invest in this kid, it can pay off if he gets a major league contract.
Dominican Joe Cubas. Or whatever his name is.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Joe Cubas is a perfect example of that. Yeah, the agent who went down there and and did very well for himself. Yeah. So where are the ball players coming from, right? And there was a style of baseball that Black Americans played that changed the game. It was much more fun. It was, it was exciting, and it relied on speed. And so you saw, since the best players were now coming out of the Dominican, you did see more of that style, free swinging. You didn't see guys who were trying to walk, and that was the old expression: you don't walk off the island. Get out of the DR, you better swing and swing big. But that ran right into metrics, which people call it sabermetrics, and for those who don't know the term, it's from the SABR part is Society for American Baseball Research, which showed that no, getting on base is more productive than hitting the ball. Just a walk became as valuable as a base hit. Stolen bases were too risky. And it made the game boring, and for some people unwatchable. And so now what's interesting is the rules changes are to bring the speed back. That's why you can't throw over to first base as many times. It's part of the reason the bases are a little bigger. I mean, it's only an inch each way, but
makes a difference.
They want the stolen bases. They want the speed game back, because sitting around and waiting for somebody to hit a home run, once every 5 innings, that's boring. So the old style game that African Americans brought into it, people realized that's what they loved. that was also the AstroTurf game of the 70s and the 80s. That was, I hated the St. Louis Cardinals, but they sure played a great game of baseball because they played on that. I stood on that field of the old Busch Stadium. It was freaking concrete, painted green, basically.
It was
But
huge too, wasn't it?
it was huge, yeah, until they moved it in for McGuire, and
Uh,
um, that was kind of a shame. When all right, here's a little kind of related to what you were saying about the things that can change the game. When I was going to Cardinals games in the 80s, as a Mets fan, I was that jerk, walking around the Mizzou campus in a Mets hat, and I'd go to games in St. Louis. And as much as I despised them, there were some of the best fans in the game. And one of the ways you measure how good fans are or how knowledgeable, is how they're reacting to fly balls. A smart fan knows when the ball's hit, look at the outfielder. He's going to tell you instantly if the ball's in or out, where it's going to be. Mm-hmm. If a player drops his hands and like, okay, that ball's gone. If he runs to a spot, a smart fan knows in that second, okay, it's going to be a fly ball out. And you would hear St. Louis fans react and think that way. Well, then here comes McGuire. And all they want to see is these bombs. I mean, hit the ball sometimes, 500 feet straight up, and fans now are screaming until it's caught. And all of a sudden, what happened to these fans who knew the game the way they did? They just want to see the ball fly out of the park, and it changed the game. It was, and not for the better. But we're getting back. We're getting back. I think that with the pitch clock, the changes they've made, it's much more exciting than it was. And that style. So whatever style a community brings, whether it's African Americans, whether it's Dominicans, whether it's Venezuelans or anybody, that is going to be secondary now to what the metrics of the game say are effective. Because, if you're a GM, you're not putting together a team because it's exciting to watch. You're putting together to win. And how baseball will adjust the rules to keep it so it's still exciting and doesn't become that stultified game that it was for so long.
Yeah. Well, look, TJ, this has been great. Amazing conversation, at least from my perspective. I want to ask you last question. This migration of great iconic writers, I think mostly columnists, but also reporters. So when guys like, is it the columnists like Tony Kornheiser, and who doesn't have necessarily a face for TV, but he's amazing on TV, Michael Wilbon, and the reporters like yourself, who are the ones that are getting all the opportunities? I assume it's probably the columnists. And how has that worked itself out over time?
It's become, it used to be, Kornheiser and Wilbon, they changed the game because, ESPN recognized we can put two knowledgeable people who've done the grunt work, know how to report, know how to talk about this. It was not the same as talk radio, where you get guys who, not true all the time, but you have a number of hosts who've never worked a beat, have no idea. They just have strong opinions. Now it's a mixture. We've got, like, look at two of the personalities at my own place. Well, three of them. One, the biggest name at ESPN is Stephen A. Smith. And people have opinions on Stephen A. I like Stephen A. I always have. One thing I love about Stephen A. is it's no act. That's him. That's him. It's like no, not putting on a show for you. That's who he is. But Stephen worked a beat. Stephen, was a newspaper guy. He knew what he was talking about, and that's how he became credible. Is he credible 100% of the time on every topic? No, because nobody can be 24 hours a day, and that's what his job is. People engage with him because he is engaging, because he's so passionate. He's out there. Same with Chris Russo, the Mad Dog. I like Chris. When I was doing the Brittany Griner story, the two of the smartest interviews that I did where I was being interviewed were with him. Wow. Chris knew his stuff, and that comes out. But look at guys like no, not just guys. Mina Kimes, who's a Yale grad, has become one of our most important NFL voices because she has opinions, but she knows the game so well. And then you have Pablo Torre, who is a Harvard graduate, incredibly engaging guy. And for my money, Bomani Jones might be the smartest colleague I have at ESPN. He's not really with us all the time anymore, but I've talked to Bomani off camera, and I know that whatever he says on there, these are not prepared lines. He has an exceptional mind. So it's this combination of, it's not just a matter of throwing fireballs and saying exciting stuff for the sake of doing it. Every one of those people knows what they're talking about. They know what they're doing. And the opinions aren't just pulled out of their pocket for the sake of it. They're well thought out. And they're all engaging, smart people. And to me, that's what's going to stand out. It used to be columnists because that's who was able to have an opinion in the print world and knew what they were talking about. At least some of them, you hope so. But in this climate, it's going to be, look, we've also got Pat McAfee, who's a very different kind of breed, and he and I have very different jobs, and he does his very well and has been very successful with it. More power to him.
Yeah.
But the ones, it's a different role from those other people. What those guys have in common with Kornheiser and Wilbon is they have opinions, but they were based on real research, real knowledge, real reporting.
Exactly. Well, look, TJ, I mean, you're a phenomenal reporter. I'm really thankful for my friend Preston Green for connecting us. I had a great time talking to you. Thanks for taking so much time. I know you're really busy, and good luck to your son. I hope he's able to follow in your footsteps and navigate this crazy world of journalism.
I hope he leaves me in the dust. Thanks. Yeah. No, Julian, pleasure's mine. And yeah, anybody's ever been around Preston Green in their life, and I've known him since we were in elementary school. He's one of the most fascinating human beings I've ever had the pleasure to know.
He is very funny, very sarcastic too. So anyway, TJ, again, I really appreciate it. Thanks for doing this, and hopefully we can keep in touch.
Would love to. Thanks, Julian.
Okay, buddy. You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.